Picture this. You're in a dimly lit, damp stone chamber. The air is thick with the smell of rust and despair. This isn't a scene from a horror movie. This was the grim reality of medieval Europe's most feared places, the torture chambers. We often think of the Middle Ages as a time of knights and castles, but beneath the chivalry and romance lay a much darker world, a world where justice was often served through unimaginable pain. For the next 10 minutes, we're going to pull back the curtain on this terrifying aspect of history. We'll explore the real stories, the infamous devices, and the chilling psychology behind why these chambers existed in the first place. You might think you know about medieval torture from movies, but the truth is far more complex and, in many ways, far more disturbing. So, brace yourself. We're about to descend into the dungeons of history. Now, why did these chambers even exist? It wasn't always about mindless cruelty. In the medieval legal system, a confession was often considered the queen of proofs, the highest form of evidence. Without a confession, it was incredibly difficult to secure a conviction, especially for serious crimes like heresy or treason. So, the authorities, both secular and religious, turned to coercion. Torture was seen as a legitimate, albeit extreme, tool to extract the truth. The logic, however twisted, was that an innocent person would endure any amount of pain to maintain their innocence, while a guilty person would eventually break and confess. This created a terrifying paradox. If you confessed to stop the pain, you were guilty. If you endured the pain and died, you were sometimes declared innocent posthumously. It was a no-win situation for many. Let's talk about the places themselves. These weren't just random basements. They were often located in the bowels of castles, fortresses, or city halls. The Tower of London, for example, had its infamous dungeons. In Germany, castles like the one at Nuremberg were notorious for their torture facilities. These locations were chosen for a reason. They were isolated, soundproof, and intimidating. The journey to the chamber was part of the psychological torment. You'd be led down winding stone staircases, the air growing colder and damper with each step, the light fading away, replaced by the flickering of a few torches. The final door would creak open to reveal a room filled with instruments that looked like they were forged in a nightmare. The goal was to break your spirit before a single hand was laid on you. The person orchestrating this horror was the torturer, often a grim, hooded figure in popular imagination. In reality, they were official executioners or specialized functionaries, sometimes even surgeons or barbers, who had a grim knowledge of human anatomy. Their job was not to kill the prisoner, at least not right away. A dead suspect couldn't confess. Their expertise was in inflicting maximum pain without causing a fatal injury. They were masters of a gruesome craft, knowing just how far to push the human body before it gave out. They kept meticulous records, noting the methods used, the questions asked, and the prisoner's responses. This cold, bureaucratic approach makes the entire process even more chilling. It wasn't chaos, it was a calculated system of suffering. So, what kind of instruments were in their toolkit? Let's start with something you've probably heard of, the rack. This was a wooden frame with rollers at each end. The victim's ankles were tied to one end and their wrists to the other. As the interrogator turned the handles, the rollers would pull the victim's limbs in opposite directions, slowly dislocating every joint in their body. The sound of ligaments tearing and bones popping was said to be unbearable. The rack was a symbol of judicial cruelty, designed for slow, agonizing pressure until the victim either confessed or was permanently maimed. Its effectiveness was in its gradual escalation of pain, giving the victim ample time to contemplate their fate. Then there was the strappado, also known as the rope. It sounds simple, but its effects were devastating. The victim's hands were tied behind their back, and the rope was slung over a beam or pulley. They were then hoisted into the air, forcing their arms to twist into an unnatural position and dislocating their shoulders. To increase the agony, weights could be attached to their feet, or they could be suddenly dropped a short distance. A technique called a squassation, which would jerk their entire body with excruciating force. This method was a favorite of the Inquisition because it left few external marks, making it seem less brutal than it actually was. But the internal damage and the sheer agony were immense. Let's move on to instruments that targeted specific parts of the body. The thumbscrew was a small but vicious device. The victim's thumbs, and sometimes fingers or toes, were placed in a vice-like instrument that was slowly tightened, crushing the digits in the nail beds. The pain was sharp, intense, and focused, capable of making even the most resolute individual scream for mercy. Similarly, the leg crusher or Spanish boot was an iron casing that enclosed the leg. Wedges would be hammered between the casing and the victim's shin, tightening the device until the shin bone itself would shatter. These tools were examples of how medieval torturers developed a sophisticated understanding of inflicting localized, unbearable pain, but it wasn't all about stretching and crushing. Water torture was another popular method. In one form, the victim was tied down and a funnel was forced into their mouth. Large quantities of water were then poured down their throat, creating a terrifying sensation of drowning from the inside. The stomach would distend to a painful degree, and the body's natural gag reflexes would make the experience pure agony. This method was particularly cruel because it played on one of our most primal fears, the fear of drowning while leaving, almost no visible trace of the ordeal, making it another favorite for those wishing to maintain a facade of civility. Now we arrive at one of the most infamous and mythologized of all torture devices, the Iron Maiden. It's the image many of us conjure up: a human-shaped iron cabinet lined with sharp spikes. The victim is forced inside, and the doors are closed, impaling them from all sides. Here's the shocking truth: the Iron Maiden is largely a myth. While a few examples exist, historical research suggests they were fabricated long after the medieval period, probably in the 18th or 19th century, to create sensational exhibits for museums. There is no concrete evidence that an Iron Maiden was ever used for judicial torture in the Middle Ages. The spikes in the surviving models are often too short to be lethal and seem designed to intimidate rather than kill. It's a powerful symbol, but one that belongs more to folklore than to actual history. So if the Iron Maiden is a myth, what was the real peak of medieval cruelty? The truth is, the most common forms of torture were often the simplest: flogging, branding with hot irons, or the simple, prolonged deprivation of sleep and food. Psychological torture was just as important as physical. Prisoners were kept in solitary confinement, in complete darkness, often with vermin, to break their will. They were subjected to mock executions, where they were led to the gallows and prepared for death, only to be returned to their cell at the last moment. This constant cycle of hope and despair was designed to shatter a person's sanity, making them more likely to confess to anything, true or not. The line between torture for confession and punishment for a crime was often blurry. Once a confession was obtained or a verdict was reached, the punishment could be just as brutal. Public executions were common spectacles. Methods like being burned at the stake for heresy, or being hung, drawn, and quartered for treason in England, were designed to be terrifying public deterrents. The drawing part involved being tied to a horse and dragged to the execution site. Hanging was often done to the point of near death, not to kill. The quartering involved disembowelment while still alive, before the body was finally cut into 4 pieces. These were brutal, theatrical displays of state power. So, who were the victims? While we often think of heretics and witches being the primary targets, especially during the height of the Inquisition and the witch hunts, torture was also used on common criminals: thieves, murderers, and debtors. It wasn't limited to one group. Anyone accused of a serious crime could find themselves in the chamber. The system was stacked against the accused from the start. They weren't told who their accusers were. They had limited access to legal defense and any confession. Even one extracted under duress was considered valid. It was a terrifying legal landscape where innocence was not a guaranteed protection. Now for the payoff. When did this all end? The decline of judicial torture wasn't a single event, but a slow, gradual process driven by the Enlightenment in the 17th and 18th centuries. Thinkers like Cesare Beccaria, in his work on crimes and punishments, argued powerfully against torture, not just on moral grounds, but on logical ones. He pointed out that torture was a terrible way to find the truth. A weak person would confess to anything to stop the pain, while a strong person might resist even if they were guilty. His ideas spread across Europe. Prussia abolished it in 1754, Sweden in 1772, and France officially ended it after the Revolution in 1789. Legal systems began shifting toward evidence-based trials, where the burden of proof was on the prosecution, and a confession was no longer the ultimate goal. The medieval torture chamber, with its racks and its screws, represents a dark chapter in the human quest for justice. It's a stark reminder of what can happen when fear and dogma override reason and humanity. While devices like the Iron Maiden may be more fiction than fact, the reality of the strapado, the rack, and the psychological torment was all too real for thousands of people. Learning about this history isn't just about sensationalism. It's about understanding the long and difficult journey toward the legal rights and protections we often take for granted today. The shadows of these chambers serve as a permanent warning from our past. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into a dark corner of history. If you found this fascinating, please hit that like button and subscribe for more explorations into the past. Let me know in the comments which historical topic you'd like to see me cover next. Thanks for watching.